A U.S. fighter jet goes down over Iran, Israel is still under missile attack, and somewhere behind all of that, a 48-hour countdown starts ticking in the background. That is not a movie trailer. That is the kind of moment that turns a regional war into something much bigger, much faster, and much harder to control. Reports over the last 2 days said an American F-15E was shot down over Iran. One crew member was initially rescued. The second was later recovered in a dangerous operation, and President Trump warned Iran it had 48 hours to reopen the Strait of Hormuz or face more punishment. At the same time, missile fire on Israel has continued, including barrages that have kept cities on edge and reinforced how live this conflict still is. That changes the feeling of the war immediately, because up until a moment like this, people can still tell themselves the conflict is harsh but manageable, dangerous but contained, dramatic but still running inside limits. Then a U.S. jet gets shot down in enemy airspace. Then America has to send people in to pull out its own crew. Then Israel is still taking incoming fire. Then a deadline appears over one of the most important oil choke points on Earth. And suddenly this does not feel like a distant exchange anymore. It feels like the system is running out of guardrails. And here is the first thing to understand if you are watching this from the United States. The downed jet matters for one reason that is bigger than the aircraft itself. It proves Iran can still impose a cost. Not just launch missiles, not just issue threats, not just make headlines. Impose a cost. Shooting down a U.S. F-15E deep inside Iranian territory is not symbolic noise. It is a direct challenge to American power, American confidence, and the idea that air superiority automatically makes the battlefield safe for the side with better technology. And once that happens, the entire war changes tone. Because Americans can tolerate a lot of distant military language. They can tune out words like escalation, deterrence, regional stability, proxy networks, maritime pressure, but they understand something far simpler. A U.S. fighter jet was downed. A crew member was stranded. American forces had to go back in. That locks attention immediately. That is how foreign conflict becomes personal without ever reaching U.S. soil. Now add Israel to that picture. Because this is not happening in isolation. Israel is still under pressure. Reporting in recent days described continued Iranian missile fire and the impact on Israeli life, including restrictions in Jerusalem and repeated alerts tied to the broader war. That matters because it means the conflict is not pausing while Washington figures out its next step. The battlefield is still moving. The missile threat is still active. The emotional pressure is still rising. That is the first hard takeaway. That is the first hard takeaway. This is no longer just a war of strikes. It is a war of tempo. Iran is trying to prove it can keep America and Israel reacting at the same time. Keep Israel under missile threat. Keep the U.S. under operational pressure. Keep the region watching. Keep oil markets nervous. Keep the wider world asking whether this is still a containable conflict or the front edge of something much uglier. And the reason that matters is simple. In modern war, making your enemy react everywhere at once can matter almost as much as landing a direct hit. Now let's talk about the 48-hour countdown, because that part is not just dramatic, it is dangerous. CBS reported that President Trump warned Iran it had 48 hours to reopen the Strait of Hormuz or face additional action. That means the clock is not ticking toward vague diplomacy. And that matters because the Strait of Hormuz is not some side issue. It is ticking toward a possible next round of U.S. escalation if Tehran does not back down on one of the most sensitive pieces of the entire conflict. And that matters because the Strait of Hormuz is not some side issue. It carries roughly a fifth of global oil and petroleum liquids consumption and more than a quarter of seaborne oil trade. You squeeze that lane hard enough, and the entire world feels it. So now think about how these three things connect. A U.S. fighter jet down in Iran, Israel still under attack. A 48-hour warning tied to the world's most important energy choke point. That is not three separate stories. That is one story. A story about pressure stacking faster than diplomacy can absorb it. And this is where people get the timeline wrong. They think wars become dangerous when leaders officially announce some new phase. That is not how it works. Wars become dangerous when separate pressure points start syncing up. Military loss, civilian threat, energy leverage, political deadlines. When those line up at the same time, the risk multiplies. That is where we are. Here is the concrete example. Imagine you are the White House. A U.S. warplane has been shot down. You have already had to run a rescue mission. Israel is still taking fire. Oil markets are watching Hormuz. Allies are asking what comes next. Your domestic audience is hearing the words downed jet, Iran, and 48 hours in the same news cycle. That is not a calm policy environment. That is the kind of environment where every next move is judged as either strength or weakness, and leaders start feeling trapped by the very pressure they are trying to manage. And that is exactly why this moment feels so unstable. Because Iran is sending one message: we can still hurt you. America is sending another: we can still escalate. Israel is living a third reality. The attacks are not theoretical, they are still happening. Confidence is now the battlefield. Put those together, and you get a war that is no longer just about who can strike harder. It becomes about who breaks the other side's confidence first. That is the second hard takeaway. Confidence is now the battlefield. Confidence that U.S. forces can operate without major loss. Confidence that Israeli defenses can keep the home front functioning. Confidence that shipping through Hormuz can remain viable. Confidence that this war is still bounded. Every one of those is under stress at the same time. And here is why the downed F-15 matters beyond the military angle. Even if the crew was rescued, even if the aircraft is only one loss, it gives Iran a propaganda victory and a strategic talking point. It says the sky over Iran is not cost-free. It says American operations can still get bloody. It says that even the most advanced power in the world is not invulnerable when it goes hunting deep inside hostile territory. Does a 48-hour warning mean full-scale war is now guaranteed? One aircraft loss does not decide a war, but it can absolutely change the emotional climate around one. Now let's be fair, because this is where bad analysis becomes panic. Does one downed jet mean Iran is winning? No. Does a 48-hour warning mean full-scale war is now guaranteed? No. Does continued missile fire on Israel automatically mean the next phase will be catastrophic? No. But here is what it does mean. It means the cost of miscalculation just got higher. It means the margin for political theater just got smaller. It means every next step is happening under more pressure than the last one. That is how escalation works in real life. Not one cinematic leap. A series of moments that keep shrinking the safe options. And the worst part is that each side can still convince itself it is acting rationally. Iran can say it is deterring enemies and imposing consequences. The US can say it is restoring deterrence and protecting commerce. Israel can say it is defending itself under active attack. All three can believe that at once. And all three can still push the conflict closer to a point nobody actually wanted. That is why the next 48 hours matter so much. Not because clocks are magical, because deadlines compress behavior. If Hormuz remains choked, the White House is pressured to act. If Iran wants to prove the warning does not scare it, it is pressured to resist. If Israel keeps taking fire, it is pressured to keep hitting back. And if markets sense that none of this is cooling down, then oil, shipping, and inflation pressure start carrying the war into ordinary life. That is when Americans who never cared about air defense maps or Gulf shipping lanes start caring very quickly. Because suddenly, the war is not just about missiles and fighter jets. One more retaliatory strike, each one on its own, sounds manageable to somebody. Together, they create a war rhythm that gets harder and harder to interrupt. It is about gas prices, airline fares, freight costs, and whether another external shock is about to hit an economy that was already tired of surprises. And that brings us to the part most people do not want to hear. The most dangerous scenario is not necessarily the biggest single strike. It is the accumulation. One jet down, one rescue mission, one more missile barrage on Israel, one deadline over Hormuz, one more shipping scare, one more retaliatory strike. Each one on its own sounds manageable to somebody. Together, they create a war rhythm that gets harder and harder to interrupt. That is the third hard takeaway. Wars do not always explode because of one giant event. Sometimes they harden because smaller events stop leaving room for de-escalation. And right now, that hardening is the real story. So what happens next? There are really three paths. First, the pressure works. Iran backs off just enough in Hormuz. The immediate deadline passes without a major new U.S. escalation. Israel's defenses hold. Missile fire begins to fade, and this moment is remembered as a terrifying crest rather than a permanent break. Second, the conflict stays in the danger zone. Iran keeps enough pressure alive to make Hormuz feel unstable. Israel remains under intermittent attack, and America keeps escalating in pieces rather than one huge move. That is the grinding warpath, not clean enough to end, not quiet enough to ignore. Third, something snaps. Another major U.S. loss, a deadlier missile strike in Israel, a direct hit that changes the politics, or a Hormuz crisis that pushes Washington into a broader campaign. That is the path where the war stops looking like a conflict to be managed and starts looking like a regional fire too big to box in. Those are the paths. And right now, nobody honest can tell you which one is guaranteed. People keep asking whether this is the moment the war truly changes. The better question is whether this is the moment enough pieces changed at once that the old assumptions stop working. A U.S. jet downed over Iran says the sky is not safe. Israel under attack says the home front is not calm. A 48-hour warning over Hormuz says the economic front is now part of the same battlefield. That is not a normal headline stack. That is the kind of stack that turns a crisis into a countdown. And when a war starts feeling like a countdown, everyone moves differently. Leaders, markets, allies, enemies, and the public watching it all unfold. Because once the clock is visible, every hour starts to feel heavier than the last.